I was talking with my wife this week. Isn't it amazing how time just seems to move faster and faster? I mean, the days sometimes can seem long, but the weeks just seem to fly by, and the months, and here we are in the last week of September. It's almost October of 2021. And even when it comes to this series, it seems like we just started in Ecclesiastes, and yet here we are, week 6, coming to the end of it. I said at the beginning of this book that most people, if you've heard sermons from Ecclesiastes, they're probably either from chapter 3 or chapter 12. And so we talked about chapter 3, and we're going to talk about it a little more today, and then we're getting to chapter 12 today, the conclusion of the whole matter. But real quickly, before we get going, let's just talk about where we've been. And as I do that, let me just say that all these are available on YouTube if you want to go back and look. So if you remember the first Sunday 6 weeks ago, we talked about how really there's two voices in this book. There's the teacher, which we've heard from all these weeks, and then there's also the editor. And that may have been easy to forget over these weeks because we've not heard from anybody but the teacher. But in chapter 12, the editor comes back into play here. But at the beginning of this book, the editor introduces the theme of the teacher, which is that he's on a quest here to discover how to best live life under the sun, under the fall, under the curse. And so right off the bat, we're greeted with these cheery words from the teacher. Absolute futility, says the teacher, absolute futility. Everything is futile. And so it begins. So in that second half of chapter 1, all the way through chapter 2, we hear the firsthand account of how the teacher took these different approaches in his quest to find meaning under the sun. First, he tried intellectualism, we'll call it, trying to learn everything that he could, and more than that, learning how to apply it, learning to have wisdom. And he was good at both those things. Amazing. In fact, the best, because he had this God-given wisdom, so much so that people from all over the world would come to hear him and learn from him. But in the end, he found himself frustrated because while knowledge and wisdom are helpful in this life, they don't actually change anything most of the time. It might possibly make your life easier while you're here, but it has no effect on where you end up, which is the grave. And so he says, okay, then I'm going to try pleasure. And he pivots. And as one of the wealthiest men in the history of the world, Solomon was probably worth $2 trillion in today's dollars. He was in a perfect spot to try it all. And after years, decades of pursuing everything unimaginable, and probably a few things that we can't imagine or shouldn't, he comes to the same place, concluding that it's all meaningless. Knowledge doesn't change anything, and pleasure doesn't last. It's here for a second, and then it's gone. If life is a mist, it's vapor, it's hevel, then even more so for pleasure. And yet at the same time, it always leaves you wanting more and always chasing it a little bit further, right? And then in chapter 3, which we're going to talk about more tonight, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, we see the faith of the teacher. Amidst all of his struggles with life under the sun, he has this beautiful poem, that we all know about. There's a time to be born and a time to die and a time to plant and uproot, etc. And then you see his faith on display there. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. Chapters 4 through 5 then is him wrestling sort of with what that means and how that works in day-to-day life under the sun, kind of objections that people have to the idea that God would be in control. How could that possibly be with all the injustice and loneliness and pride and ultimately especially all the death in the world? And then chapters 6 through 8 are, one pastor that I listened to in this series, he titled these two sermons in there, Coffee with Granddaddy, right? Sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, just listening to him tell stories and letting him impart some wisdom to us. So those chapters are into chapters 9 and 10 are very Proverbs-esque, right? You might think that you're in Proverbs if you weren't looking. And so it says things like this: don't pay attention to everything people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For in your heart, you know that many times you yourself have cursed others. Isn't that the truth, right? Everybody hates on the boss, but then when you get the promotion, it's not as funny anymore, right, to make fun of him because you are him and you know what's happening behind your back. Don't pay attention too much to what people say, because if you do, you might find out that you don't like what they're saying because you know that you've done the same thing. Stuff like that he talks about in those chapters. I wish we had time in the series, but we don't, so we move on. In chapters 9 through 12, then, you kind of see it starting to where the seatbelt lights come on. we're starting to make our descent, starting to land this plane of the book of Ecclesiastes. And so we're going to come to back to chapter 9 here in a second. Chapter 10 is more of this sort of fatherly wisdom, in particular about work and money and business and relationships in that and leadership. And then in chapter 11, verse 6, it takes another turn, and the teacher starts talking about the experiences of being young and being old and what's appropriate in what spot. And he gives this description of what it's like to be old that runs into chapter 12 that is a pretty vivid and stark description of it all. When the lights go out. And I love the moment where it says, when you're afraid of heights and afraid of danger on the street. Because some things never change. There's nothing new under the sun, including, the way that older people tend to react to that kind of thing. I remember my grandma just being terrified of, us getting towards a ledge. And now I find myself, trying to keep my kids back from the edge. So I get it. And then as we wrap up this book, the teacher's part of it anyway, he leaves us with one final word in chapter 12, verse 8. You ready for it? Here it is. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Everything is futile. So the only thing that changed in this slide from the last one is the reference at the bottom. We've come full circle, 11 and a half chapters in this case, and the teacher gets in one last hevel, the word that we've learned and used so much during this series. And so now then the editor comes back into the picture. You could think of this section as a foreword to a book today. You know how people will write a book and then they have someone else write the foreword? I really don't like that, by the way. If I go to read a book, I've already probably at least looked up the author, know who he is, enough that I've decided to read it. I don't need another guy to do a poor interpretation of what he's going to tell me and then tell me how great the author is. I already think that enough to read the book anyway. So anyway, that's just my own little pet peeve there. But this one's okay because it's God's word. They kind of summarize what he's going to say and talk about how great they are. And so this editor, he has both the preface and the epilogue in this case. He does it at the beginning and the end. And look at what he says, starting in verse 9 of chapter 12. In addition to the teacher being a wise man, he constantly taught the people knowledge. He weighed, explored, and arranged many proverbs. The teacher sought to find delightful sayings and write words of truth accurately. So just in case we might think that the editor is going to come in and say something opposite to what the teacher says and correct him, he gets that out of the way right at the beginning, because he says that this teacher is a wise man and he's teaching the people knowledge, and he affirms what the teacher's been saying. And then in verse 11 of chapter 12, he says, the sayings of the wise are like cattle prods, and those from masters of collections are like firmly embedded nails. The sayings are given by one shepherd. So a cattle prod, what you use to whack sheep or cows or whatever, a stick to get their attention, to get them going back in the right direction. And if you think about it, if you've watched or participated in these 6 weeks, hasn't Ecclesiastes felt like that at times? I mean, even the last week talking about death, right? It's a cattle prod almost. It's a stick to go like, hey, pay attention. Don't go this way, go that way. Pay attention to this and head in this direction. It's a cattle prod. It's not fun. It's not something that you would sign up for. I'm sure the sheep wouldn't either, but the sheep need it. Notice if we look back at the verse for just a second, the capital S there in shepherd. So what the editor is saying is that this is not just words from a wise man. This is words from an all-wise God. He is the shepherd. And Jesus would come and say that he is the great shepherd. And then he gives one of the high school and college students' favorite verses in verse 12. But beyond these, my son, be warned. There is no end to the making of many books, and much study wearies the body. So there's your verse. If you're studying, you're like, I can't take it anymore. It's in the Bible right there. So you think about the statement, though, in relation to all that the teacher has taught us in his quest to understand and find meaning in life. You could go to Barnes & Noble or Borders. Borders doesn't exist anymore. Books A Million, or Amazon, where everybody else does. And there are literally thousands of books telling you the meaning of life. All the same stuff that the teacher has been wrestling with about death and about life and how to live it well and how to be more productive and more successful and have better relationships and et cetera, et cetera. And those are all fine and good. There's nothing necessarily wrong with them as a category. Some of them can be super helpful. But hear the words of the Father to his Son. There are a lot of people going to try to tell you a lot of things about life. Be careful about going beyond what these words say. And then verse 13, probably the most, for sure, in preacher world, in the Christian world, the most quoted part of Ecclesiastes. When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commands, because this is the duty of all humanity. So when all has been heard, which we have at this point, right? We've heard almost the entire book. When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commands. Now, if you've been watching along, I want you to just think about this for a second. If you think about all that we've looked at in the book of Ecclesiastes, and somebody asked you, sum up Ecclesiastes for me, would you? Would you come up with fear God and keep his commands because this is the duty of all humanity? Honestly, I don't think I probably would have. But one of the first rules of reading the Bible is you let the Bible interpret the Bible. And so evidently, the conclusion of the matter that the teacher has been talking about this whole time is wrapped up in these words: fear God and keep his commands. And so what we need to do then, what I needed to do then, and I think you would too if you start thinking about it, is, okay, so then what have we learned? All the things that we've learned in this book, how does that apply? How does that come under this overarching sort of theme that the editor says is the conclusion of the matter of fearing God and keeping his commands? The editor, thankfully, is bringing clarity to this point for the sake of his own son, because he says, my son, but we get to listen in, and I'm grateful for it. And so how do we learn to fear God and keep his commands in the book of Ecclesiastes? So kind of looking at the major themes of this book and then figuring out how they work. 3 points for tonight. Really 2 main ones, because we talked about the last one last week. Here's the first. How do we learn to fear God in Ecclesiastes? By accepting our seasons as part of his plan. Accepting our seasons as part of his plan. That's one of the core messages of this book. When the topic first came up in chapter 3, it was the first time in this book that God's plan, that life over the sun, came into the picture, at least in a positive light. It was the first time that the teacher wasn't coming from this place of what seemed like agnosticism or depression or having some kind of midlife crisis. He observes all of these events in life. He writes this poem about all the seasons, like we said, the turn lyrics. And he doesn't follow it this time like he did in chapter 1 with the statement of futility. Instead, he follows it with a statement of faith that the sender of the seasons, God, will make everything beautiful in its time. We so desperately want to stop the wheels of time from turning, don't we? I mean, I know I've quoted a lot of songs in this series, and so I don't want to end the series without doing it. And so, whatever genre you want, there are songs that talk about this thing. If you like rock and roll, let's talk about Pink Floyd and Time. The sun is the same in a relative way, but you're older, shorter of breath, and one day closer to death. Does that sound like Ecclesiastes to you? Yeah, it does. Darius Rucker. If you like country music, it won't be like this for long. This is not even a joke. I was thinking about the message when I woke up. While I was brushing my teeth this morning, I watched the YouTube video and was getting teary-eyed thinking about laying down beside my girls till their eyes are finally closed. And watching it just breaks my heart because I already know it won't be like this for long. One day soon, my little girl is going to be all grown up and gone. Time is moving on. If you're into pop, I'm sorry. Maybe you need to get some counseling for that. But if you are, there's still songs about this. Macklemore, with a song featuring Kesha, Good Old Days. I wish somebody would have told me, babe, that someday these days would be the good old days. And if you're more traditionalist and you like big band and crooners, which I love. Frank Sinatra singing September of My Years. One day you turn around and it's summer, next day you turn around and it's fall, and the springs and the winters of a lifetime. Whatever happened to them all? This problem that the teacher has dealt with in the book of Ecclesiastes is a universal human experience across all genres, across all generations, and across all time. We so desperately want to wind it back to the day when everything was good. And most of all, we want to avoid it because we know the day that it's leading towards. Why is this so deeply ingrained in us? Well, the teacher's answer is that God has placed eternity in our hearts. We rage against the passing of time because deep down in our very souls, Eden has left its imprint on each of us. We know that it wasn't meant to be like this. And that's right, it wasn't. We were meant to live forever. And so the eternity in our hearts pushes against the reality of our lives under the sun. The next line of that verse in chapter 3 said, "No one can discover the work God has done from beginning to end. He works so that people will be in awe of him." Or in other words, the fear of God. Right? We're not talking about fear. When we say fear God and keep his commandments, I'm scared of him. It's about right reverence of him as God. It means that we believe his word is true and we preach it to our hearts even when we can't see it with our eyes. You ever heard of this idea known as the butterfly effect? It's actually more of a pop culture thing than it is a science thing. It originally came from a Robert Redford movie in 1990, but it has its roots in a scientific, part of scientific realm called chaos theory. And in that movie, he says this line that kind of started the idea, which is a butterfly can flutter its wings over a flower in China and cause a hurricane in the Caribbean. Right? Everything is so interconnected, and so that's why they call it chaos theory, because there's so many tiny variables that are not knowable that can change everything. And the reason I bring that up is to say this, really the point that the teacher is making in those verses. God knows all of those contingencies. The omniscient God who existed outside of time, before it and after it, because he's outside of it, he knows not only everything that will happen or everything that won't happen, he knows what would happen if everything else happened, if that butterfly hadn't flapped its wings. Do you realize all the things that had to happen for you to exist, to be hearing my voice right now? I mean, just a single one of your ancestors doesn't make it to the same place to meet their spouse at the same time, and you do not exist. Don't let anybody tell you that you're an accident, by the way. That's just not possible when you're talking about the unimaginable amount of things that had to fall perfectly in place for you to be you and me to be me. And God knows all of those. And so he is actively working, sovereign over our seasons, bringing things into our life that we love and that we don't love, and a time to be born and a time to die, all of it working together for his purpose, so that people will stand in awe of him, so that they will fear him. See, accepting our season of life as it comes means acknowledging at the deepest part of our souls when we're alone, when we're not trying to put on, when we're actually real with ourselves, when it's just you and him, that acknowledging and not just acknowledging, but enjoying the fact that he is creator and you are creature. You don't have to try to be sovereign over your seasons because, number one, you're not. And number two, it'll drive you crazy to try to be. But you can go, it's all in your hands. I mean, it always has been, but I'm glad now that it's in your hands and I give it to you. There's a poem I came across this week. Author's unknown, but it was made popular by Corrie ten Boom, and it illustrates this idea really, really well. Talking about a master craftsman who is weaving this tapestry. It says, "My life is but a weaving between the Lord and me. I may not choose the colors. He knows what they should be. For he can view the pattern upon the upper side, while I can only see it on the underside." See, the back of a tapestry is, quite honestly, very, very ugly. It does not look good at all. Sometimes he weaves in sorrow, which seems so strange to me, but I will trust his judgment and work on faithfully. 'Tis he who fills the shuttle, and he knows what is best. So I shall weave in earnest and leave to him the rest. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttle cease to fly, shall God unroll the canvas and explain the reason why. See, for now, we only get to see the underside of all that God is weaving together under the sun. And a lot of the time, the whole thing seems like a jumbled up mess of loose ends and knots where they shouldn't be. All these colors mismatched with these seasons of life. That some of them seem way too short and others seem way too long, and they're going in every direction. Accepting our seasons as part of his plan means that we cling to the promise that someday we will see the upper side. We will see the top side of this canvas, this tapestry, and be blown away at what he was creating. And be so joyful that we got to play this little part over here in the corner. Do you see how accepting his role as sovereign season giver and accepting our rightful place as the recipients of those has everything to do with our fear, our reverence, our respect of God as he is? To do anything less, to try to buck against the seasons of our life, is just a feeble attempt to deny his authority and mistrust his goodness. So I think that we can all agree that Ecclesiastes as a whole, as we've looked at it these weeks, is not the most God-centered book, at least on the surface, right? For instance, we've talked a few times that this word hevel, vanity, appears 38 times in this book. The word God, his name, only appears 36 times. So it's less than vanity. And there's another overarching theme in this book. We looked at it in the first couple of weeks, and then I kind of tried to stay away from it the rest of the time because I knew we were going here today. But I want you to watch for God in these verses because he's only in there 36 times. I want you to watch for him as we go through these, all right? Rapid fire through these verses. First is in chapter 2, verses 24 and 26. There is nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. I have seen that even this is from God's hand, because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him? For to the person who is pleasing in his sight, he gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. So remember chapter 2, after trying everything, this is the teacher's first conclusion. There's nothing better than this right here. He would be the one to know, wouldn't he? I mean, you have to get to, in our world, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk kind of money to be able even have a chance to get to experience what Solomon experienced. And so learn from his words here, because after experiencing all of that, he goes, there's nothing better than eat, drink, and enjoy your work, because that is a gift from God's hand. And after his statement of faith that we talked about in chapter 3, that God is over all the seasons of life and will make everything beautiful in his time, he says this: I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God when anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. I have seen that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy his activities, because that is his reward. So do you see the pattern developing here? I mean, we're only to chapter 3, and you see that enjoying these simple pleasures of life is a gift from God and a reward from God for all of your labor. Chapter 5, here is what I've seen to be good. It is appropriate to eat, drink, and experience good in all the labor one does under the sun during the few days of his life God has given him, because that is his reward. Furthermore, everyone to whom God has given riches and wealth, he's also allowed him to enjoy them, take his reward, and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God. So see it there. God gives life. God gives the stuff of life, the material possessions, and God gives the ability to enjoy the first two. Chapter 8, so I commended enjoyment, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat, drink, and enjoy himself, for this will accompany him in his labor during the days of his life that God gives him under the sun. You notice how many times he's saying there's nothing better. There's nothing better. Promise me, I'm telling you, there is nothing better. And then in chapter 9, Go, eat your bread with pleasure and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your clothes be white all the time and never let oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife you love all the days of your fleeting life, which has been given to you under the sun, all your fleeting days, for that is your portion in life and in your struggle under the sun. And there are so many things in those verses that I want to say. I really wanted to spend a week on them, but we can't. And so, just for a second, I can't help but imagine the tone of voice that might have been in that Solomon might have been using when he was saying those words about enjoying your wife all the days of your life. Because we know that literally he had more than 1,000 women in his life, but there was one in particular. It was different. It was the love of his life when he was a young man. The next book in the Bible after Ecclesiastes is Song of Solomon. And I told the church this morning, I'm not preaching through Song of Solomon on a Sunday morning anytime soon because I know I would be red in the face for the majority of the series, because it's literally this young couple who is madly in love, describing in great detail what exactly they love about each other and what they're going to do later. And so here he is, Solomon, who wrote this amazing love story, lived this amazing love story. And that passion's but a distant memory to him. He's lived for pleasure, no doubt broken the heart of that first love at least 1,000 times over. And here in his last and by far most personal book, here he is saying, I'm telling you, trust me, I know, I've lived it. There is nothing better than this, to live life with the wife you love all of your days. I've done it all, and there's nothing that can compare to this. Doesn't get any better than that. Enjoy life with your wife you love all the days of your life, because it's short, and if you don't, you'll wish you had, because I did. But let's get back to the question that we're asking, which is how does enjoying life have what we've learned in Ecclesiastes have anything to do with fearing God? Well, we said first that we've learned that we fear God by accepting our seasons as part of his plan. Here's the second thing. We do it by enjoying our days as a gift from his hand. Enjoying our days as a gift from his hand. Of the 36 times I said God's name is used in this book, almost half of them come from these verses. So let's look at this one or these few in 9 a little closer. So he starts there with the word go, which is an imperative. It's a forceful one. It's get up and get going and enjoy your life. He says to eat your bread with pleasure. Unless you're on keto, maybe go get some keto bread and enjoy that. But the kind of bread we eat today doesn't really, most of the time, bring much pleasure, right? Have you ever had warm bread right out of the oven, homemade, a little bit of butter, maybe a little bit of honey? Man, you can't get enough. It's so good. That's what he's talking about. Eat your bread with pleasure. Drink your wine with a cheerful heart. Listen, we don't have time tonight to get into the alcohol issue deeply, other than to say this: like so many of the gifts that God gives, sinful people use in ways that it was not intended. Solomon's dad, David, wrote in Psalm 104, he, meaning God, causes grass to grow for the livestock and provides crops for man to cultivate, producing food from the earth, wine that makes human hearts glad, making his face shine with oil, and bread that sustains human hearts. Notice that it's almost the exact same list that's here in Ecclesiastes. So Solomon was listening to his dad. And while grape juice is good, and I don't deny that, Welch's does not have the effect that it's talking about here of making the heart glad. Eating your bread doesn't mean gluttony, and drinking your wine doesn't mean drunkenness. Those things are both sin, and Solomon writes about the dangers of both of those things quite a bit in the book of Proverbs, actually. They're really actually the same sin at the end of the day. It's looking for comfort and satisfaction, this physical high or low in the case, by overindulging in the gifts rather than the relationship with the giver. And so God's not condoning, when he says, he's already accepted your works, he's not condoning your gluttony or your drunkenness, but neither is he condemning the consumption of bread and wine. They're both gifts of God to be used in their proper place for his glory and the good of his children. The next line says, God has already accepted your works. So certainly that points forward to our future justification in Christ, where now our works are fully accepted because we're in him. But in Ecclesiastes, the teacher simply means that those things, what you have that God's given you, they're made for your joy, and he approves of them, of you using them for joy. That's why you have them, to enjoy them like a kid on Christmas morning that is so beside himself at the gift that he's been giving that he goes and he enjoys it, and then he comes running back and says, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. The Hebrew word there is actually stronger than mere just approval. It could also be translated takes pleasure in. And doesn't that just make sense? I mean, that's the joy of Christmas, isn't it? For the parents to delight in your children's delight. And listen, God takes pleasure, and you're taking pleasure in the gifts that he has given to you for your enjoyment, like all the things that he's mentioned. So these passages that we've read, they're referred to as the Carpe Diem passages by some people in Ecclesiastes. It's this Latin, phrase that's often translated seize the day, but more accurately it would be pluck the day, because it's ripe right now, and tomorrow it won't be good anymore. So pick it right now and enjoy all the sweet tastes of life. And the teacher would agree. But how is enjoying gifts of God related to our reverence of God, right? How does eat, drink, and enjoy your work translate to fear God and keep his commands? Well, imagine for just a minute that you have built your dream house. I mean, you found the right property, has a great view, at the right distance from town and all the stuff that you need. It's got a nice shop out in the back so that you can go out and work on what you need to work on, everything you wanted and more. And you love it, and you live in it a few years, and then you get sick. The economy takes a turn for the worse. You lose your job, and the bank is going to foreclose soon. And so you're packing up everything and moving to a one-bedroom apartment until you find out where you can go from there. And on the last day, someone who you don't even know and never paid any attention to sells their own house and pays off your mortgage in full. You'd be incredibly grateful to that person, right? What a display of undeserved grace towards you. But then imagine the next Sunday, they're driving down the street and you pass them and you stop like neighbors do. You're driving a brand new SUV and you're dressed to the nines, and they say, wow, like you guys cleaned up nice. Where are you going tonight? And you're going to say, You're not going to believe this. We were able to get a home equity loan for 100% of the value of our house, and so we're headed to the casino. That seems like a ridiculous story, right? It's outrageous. How can anyone possibly act like that when they've been given so much? So we're commanded, that's right, it's a command, go, to accept God's gift and eat your meals with pleasure. But I had to work late tonight, so you guys go ahead, and I'll just grab something in the drive-thru on the way home. Right? It says over and over and over to find joy in your work. But you push because you got to get ahead in your career, get through this project, just get the profit, what am I trying to say? The profit margin up and the overhead down, and just save up just a little bit more so we can buy that boat that we've been talking about. And instead of finding joy in your work, you find nothing but stress and anxiety, early morning and late nights, so that when you do get home, you're not really home and you're too tired to be present with anyone anyway. It says there's nothing better under the sun than to enjoy life with your spouse all of your days, but then I think I would be better off with someone else, someone who really understands me, makes me feel alive. I mean, doesn't God want me to be happy? Right? That story sounds outrageous, and it is. And that is exactly what we do when we take the simple joys of everyday life that God has given us and go, nah, that's not good enough for me. I mean, I'm grateful, thank you, but I think if I play my cards right, I'll get even more if I take that and put it over there. You know what the problem is with gambling away God's gifts? The house always wins. Under the sun, the house always wins. And now not only have you not gotten what you were after, you also lose the best thing that you'd ever been given in the process. And that is how enjoy life during the few days you've been given under the sun relates to that summary statement of fear God and keep his commandments. Because to do anything else with his precious gifts is an affront to his glory and to his goodness and his grace on every single level. I mean, this ought to be the easiest command to obey, shouldn't it? Enjoy life. That should be fairly easy. And yet, we're so sinful that we even struggle to enjoy his gifts. See, this is why the book of Ecclesiastes is actually really hopeful. Because, amidst all of the vanity, there's the God of the universe going, I am telling you what is the best for you. My way is best. Enjoy the life that you've been given. One more time that I'm going to quote this book in this series. The teacher's conclusion is ultimately positive and profound. The gift of God does not make this meaninglessness go away. The gift of God makes this vanity enjoyable. See, it doesn't take away all of the hevel, all of the vanity of life. What it does is give us joy in the middle of it. So we fear God by accepting our seasons as part of his plan, enjoying our days as a gift from his hand. And then here's the last thing, by living our lives in light of the end. And we just looked at this in depth last week. Better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. You're better off going to a funeral than to a party, because that's the reality check that you need, because not everyone's going to end up at the party. Everyone is going to end up in the grave. There's one more verse at the end here that we have not gotten to yet. The last verse in this book of Ecclesiastes. For God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. So our days under the sun are short, and none of us knows how many more we have left, because that's in God's hands, not ours. And yet we have one last reminder in this book of death, and then what comes after it. So the teacher has shown us in this book to accept our seasons as part of his plan, enjoy our days as a gift from his hand, and live our lives in light of the end. And I think if you were going to sum that up in one sentence, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commands, because this is the duty of all humanity.